The World Skeptics Congress, Paranormal, Supernatural, Fringe Science, Pseudoscience, and How It Really Is. Berlin welcomes you.
We're skeptically interrogating you.
I don't know what about you, but during our debates, I frequently received already an answer for the question whether we share a common ancestor with monkeys. Generally, the answer was that you skeptics do, but we don't. So, in this session, we'll speak. I mean, the title of the session is Pseudoscience in the Classroom, but I think we will get not only a picture of what is happening there, but I think some of the lectures will be about how to go and how to solve this. And this reminds me that just this week in Budapest, we had a regular meeting of the skeptics, and we were speaking about whether to teach science based on the traditional way, based on the disciplines of mathematics, physics, chemistry, biology, and geography, or as a science class. I don't want to go on it, but if no one will mention this during the presentations, then I think we can have this topic during the evening. And now let's start with the presentations. Gita Sahgal is the director of the Center for Secular Space and Campaigning Against Fundamentalism in All Religions, and also produced documentaries about women issues and war crimes in Bangladesh. And the title of her presentation is Myth of Origin in the Classroom.
Thank you. This is my first Skeptics conference as well, and so I'm not sure, I'm sort of testing out whether I'm a skeptic in the sense as understood in the Congress of Skeptics, rather than just in the general sense of skepticism. But I am an atheist, and I'm in the happy position of being able to get up and say I'm an atheist, because I think that listening to the earlier presentations, and particularly Anila's presentation, looking at the very different responses within Islam and Muslim contexts and societies to the question of evolution and whether there was any harmonization or convergence between evolutionary theories and belief, I began to sort of think about the fact that my presentation, which I was very nervous of giving to this conference because I'm not a scientist, I'm highly technologically challenged, and I work on issues that relate very much to the things that you look at, but I look at fundamentalist movements. So my primary work is not to look at the science of the issue, but to actually look at the powers behind them. And in answer to the questions that were being posed to Anila, I would have my own hypotheses. I couldn't say I'd have answers because we don't know, but what we can say, what we do know, is that creation theory has been created in Muslim contexts, and probably quite recently, and that has been an outcome of years and years and years of decision-making about by, among others, Western governments, as well as by movements within Pakistan, Turkey, Indonesia, and so on, which are promoting these theories. And I think that if we're going to challenge them, we need to be able to look at the political dimensions of these movements, as well as the scientific issues involved, because we're not going to be able to defend the science without looking at the politics. Now, because of this, as I was preparing my presentation, I actually changed it at the last minute to myths of origin, classrooms, power, and politics, because what I began to write about was actually power and politics and how they affect the way in which these issues play out in the classroom. And I'm going to take a subject which I suspect is not much discussed, except in the questions in Eugenie's presentation, where we talk very briefly about Hindu ideas of creationism. And the myth of origin that I'm going to talk about is not related to directly to creation theory as we've been discussing it all day, but to a different set of ideas which are rooted in arguments about history. So, when I was growing up, I knew little about ancient Indian history, but there were some facts that seemed to be uncontroversial. India's civilization was very ancient, probably more so than classical Western civilizations. A people called the Aryans had invaded India from Central Asia, and two great city-states found by British archaeologists, which are in present-day Pakistan, had been destroyed by these invasions, that is, invasions by the Aryans. I was also aware that Indian languages were related to German in a group of languages often called Indo-Germanic or Indo-European languages, and that much of the work of investigating the relationships between languages and peoples had been done by British and German scholars, most notably William Jones, working in India, and the great German scholar Max Müller. There was much I didn't know, but following Rumsfeld, we knew that there were known unknowns, but there were also unknown unknowns. But for most people, the knowns were facts, and pretty established ones at that. Today, much of what I had thought of as fact has been destabilized by modern scholarship. But not only have hypotheses of scholars and the established consensus of opinion shifted regarding who the Aryans were and whether they invaded and conquered an earlier indigenous race of people who are known as the Dravidians. Today, as with creation theories, there is a flourishing alternative theory which absolutely rejects most modern scholarship, resurrects some of the findings of the 18th and 19th century, and puts them into service in pursuit of a very modern political project of domination and control. Myths of origin, as we've been discussing all day, are crucial to religious fundamentalist movements, playing a central role in constructing a worldview of the inerrant nature of religion and the literal truth of its texts or its fundamentals. And I think we need to be really careful. I think it's easier to do this with Christianity because, whether you reject Christianity or not, most of you have come from backgrounds that are Judeo-Christian in origin, and so you understand, the distinctions of these things. So when I'm talking about the literal truth or fundamentalist religion, I'm talking about a particular form of religion. So like creationists, ideologues of political Hinduism or Hindu fundamentalism, which is known as Hindutva, have a central myth of origin. In their case, this myth is not so much about the creation of the world as the creation of the race, which formed the basis of national identity. The Hindutva myth of origin is based on the idea of the Aryan, the foundational race, and I'm using race in inverted commas, of modern Hindutva ideology, and what they call the Vedic age, that is of the Rig Veda, the earliest Aryan text. So that age was the perfect utopia, which modern Hinduism must recover in order to establish a Hindu state. So my talk today is to try and explain how the practice of historians, based on discoveries in archaeology and linguistics, have come to clash with the myth-making of fundamentalist Hindus. And as with creationism, there are strident demands to replace history with myth, or at least to teach them side by side. As Professor Romila Thapar has said, historical questions regarding Aryan identities are now enmeshed in a variety of cultural politics. But to exclude some of the more, her point being, to exclude some of the more outrageous theories is to contribute to a sort of ideological McCarthyism. That's the charge laid against her and other very serious scholars. And I believe, as with creationism, there has been intellectual support to the Hindutva lobby as having an argument, at least, that should be heard. The very people, post-structuralists, post-colonialists, postmodernists, who argue that knowledge is shifting and contingent, and that it is always unfinished, are lending their support to movements that seek to shut down the pursuit of knowledge and to threaten not only scholarships, but the scholars themselves. Speaking in Berlin with the resonance of the meaning of racial myths based on racial superiority, particularly Aryan superiority, I'm conscious of the dangers of flattening out a very complicated story and hastening towards what may seem to be a forced conclusion. The work of scholars of the past did not lead in a linear fashion to a modern fascist ideology, nor should their research be disdained simply as a product of Orientalism, and therefore so fatally embedded in the project of empire that all their findings should be dismissed. Certainly they have to be understood in the context of their times, and we may reject some of their assumptions and discoveries while continuing to build on others. So the debate on the Aryans has focused on two main questions: who they were and when they were, in short, on identity and chronology. On these two questions is built not simply a competing view of ancient civilization, but of India's present and future. But none of these debates can be understood only in their contemporary form. The discovery of India and the intellectual engagement with Indians, that is by the West, can be read in a number of ways. But one of the things it is important to understand, that in the search for the origin of Hinduism was also a search for the origin of all mankind. While major work was done by British Orientalists in the 18th and 19th centuries, many philosophers drew on it to build on their theories. According to Chetan Bhatt, Voltaire, Herder, Kant, Schlegel, among others, saw India as the cradle of all civilization, while others such as Schelling and Hegel saw it as the original homeland of humanity. The early engagement was marked by excitement and what we may now see as an attempt to incorporate new knowledge into a common civilizational framework through a number of disciplines using comparative methods: philology, comparative mythology, and later comparative ethnology. Affinities between the languages, Latin, Greek, Sanskrit, and the ancient language of Avestan, and between these and other linguistic groups are probably the best survivors of these early attempts to understand, and they formed the foundation of modern linguistics. The term Aryan was first adopted by Friedrich Schlegel and carried on by Max Müller, the great Indologist German Indologist who worked mostly in Oxford, to describe the linguistic group, which was also called by various other names, including Indo-European and Indo-Germanic. And the term was taken from the Arya in the Rig Veda, that is one of the oldest documents of what is now seen as a foundational document of Hinduism. Max Müller insisted that the term was not a racial one. Aryan in scientific language is utterly inapplicable to race. It means language and nothing but language. Modern historians have reverted to seeing Aryans as a linguistic rather than racial grouping, but the journey from seeing Aryans as a racial entity who embodied a pure and ancient civilization led to a hunt for the geographical origins of Indo-Europeans in various parts of Europe and Central Asia. Through the 18th and 19th centuries, there was a lot of speculation about whether there was a single origin. And I'm now going to mispronounce a whole lot of German, but it was a search for Urheimat, Sprach, speech, Vok, Urvok, and Ur-mythos. I'm so sorry, of the Indo-European language family. So how strange to consider that the term Aryan was popularized by Müller because of its foreign origin to avoid its use for ethnic or national chauvinism. Eventually, the slippage between language, race, and nation became a fusion of these categories. And I don't think I need to explain to this audience what the consequences of that was in Europe. So from an early search for commonality through comparative analysis, a search for the universal, whether through concrete expressions of language or some more mystical essence, the issue of Aryan identity became involved into race theory, incorporating biological systems of classification and ideas of social Darwinism. This thoroughly bad science is a reminder to us that undoing terrible developments in the name of science is as urgent as taking on other kinds of mumbo-jumbo. Indeed, many claims of fundamentalists are not only based on divine authority, but on their supposed scientific rationality. In the late 19th century, European Aryanism had gone in one direction and Indian in another. These theories were in tension and conversation with each other, sometimes seen as branches of the same family, lost cousins, as Max Muller called an Indian social reformer. At other times, they were seen as opposites, one vigorous, the other degenerate, needing to be invigorated. And that, of course, fed into theories of colonial domination and so on. Now, one of the things I think that we often don't remember, and I was struck by this when Anila talked about the response to Darwinism in his time, is that all these movements are not behind other movements in the West. These engagements are contemporary to the engagements and the scientific developments and discoveries in the West. And in fact, they built on and reinforced each other. I think that's enormously important to understand because fundamentalist political movements are products of modernity. So therefore, we can't patronize people who are fundamentalists by saying that they're going to catch up at some point. They've developed theories which are not about catching up. They have developed theories in opposition to, but also drawing on certain modernist and postmodernist ideas. So in terms of this invigoration, there was an engagement with the colonial powers in opposition to colonial domination, but not so much a political opposition, but a religious and cultural opposition, which led to arguments around creating a new Hindu. And one of the key movements was the Arya Samaj, or Society of Aryans. So the idea of reforming Hinduism was not a new one in the late 19th century. There had been earlier reformist movements. But whereas earlier social reformers had concentrated efforts on reforms affecting women, such as widow remarriage, and campaigning against the practice of sati, burning widows on the funeral pyres of their husbands, the new ones concentrated on throwing out most of Hinduism, so did some of the earlier ones, to create a more vigorous masculine persona. They looked for clear textual authority in the earlier sources they could find, the Vedas, and saw themselves as restoring the religion to its fundamentals. And of course, here they were marching step in step with Western scholarship on the issue, which also got fascinated by this Vedic age. So Dayananda, who founded the Society of the Aryans at the end of the 19th century, said, "We believe that the Vedas alone are the supreme authority in the ascertainment of true religion, the true conduct of life. Whatever is enjoined by the Vedas we hold to be right, while whatever is condemned by them we believe to be wrong. Therefore we say that our religion is Vedic. All men, especially the Aryas, should believe in the Vedas and thereby cultivate unity in religion." He rejected the theory that the Aryans were simply a linguistic group that had originally come from outside the territory of British India. They were the original inhabitants of divine origin. The gods who came down were Aryas, described in the Rig Veda as the dominant group. The fallen ones became the Dasyus, that is, slaves or fallen ones. In ancient times, they had traveled widely and ruled the world. Divine revelation had fixed the order of the world, but they had fallen from this state and needed to be restored to it from a state of slavery and ignorance in which they existed under colonial rule. Self-determination, nationality, as well as ethnic and racial homogeneity formed a very important part of Dayananda's political agenda. European scientific progress was to be admired, but followers of the Vedic religion were not imitating the West, but believed they were simply rediscovering knowledge that had been lost, such as knowledge of electricity or Newtonian physics, and in fact you can go on and on because everything that's ever been discovered actually existed somewhere in the Vedas. And there are people writing theses around these things. He borrowed the idea of race, the need for invigoration, from the colonial discourse, while rejecting completely that the Aryans were not indigenous. Now, this movement was a political movement, and a very violent political movement, which aimed, unlike European Nazism, which believed that people were inherently outside, they did say that if you convert to Hinduism. So if minorities living in India convert, then they can become part of the Hindu fold. So they're, people of the land. But it wasn't a lot of comfort to those minorities who didn't want to convert. And in fact, there were a lot of movements in opposition to each other. Fundamentalist movements have classically formed in opposition to each other and fighting each other. So when you get to the 20th century, you have a man called Savarkar, who developed, built on some of these earlier ideas, and he was a revolutionary nationalist who was attracted, like many more secular Indian nationalists, to the idea of national liberation from the ideas of Mazzini and of the modern rising contemporary fascist movements. India has the distinction of having given birth to the foundational ideas of two major modern fundamentalist movements: political Hinduism invented by Savarkar, and political Islam invented by Maududi, the founder of the Jamaat-e-Islami, which is a huge pan-South Asian political party, and it's also very, very active in politics in Britain, Canada, the US, and so on. And sometimes promoted by governments, and people can ask me about that later, because it relates, I think, to some of the findings around creationism that we were looking at earlier. So in 1940, Savarkar said, "It is in this spirit that I want all Hindus to get themselves reanimated and reborn into a martial race. Manu, who is a lawgiver, and Sri Krishna, they are lawgivers, and Sri Ram, who is a mythical figure, the commander of our forces. Let us relearn the manly lesson they taught us, and our Hindu nation will prove again unconquerable, and conquering a race as we proved that once when they led us, conquering those who dared to be aggressive against us, and refraining ourselves not out of weakness, but out of magnanimity." So he was the one who invented this term Hindutva to distinguish ideology from religious practice. And in fact, he was also an atheist. In his personal life, he was an atheist. He instrumentally used this idea of a strong, masculinized ideology that would sort of rise from the ashes of colonial domination. So what is Hindutva? It's all departments of thought and activity, the whole of our being, of our Hindu race. And he demarcated the geographical boundaries of the Indian nation as he saw it, identified it as both a fatherland and a motherland. But if you identify geographical boundaries, and if you identify nation as territory, then you're including anybody who lives in it. And they had to have some way of differentiating between these people who were not essentially part of it. So he says the Hindus are not merely citizens of the Indian state because they are united by the bonds of love they bear to a common motherland, but also by the bonds of a common blood. They are not only a nation, but also a race, jati. The word jati is derived from the root jan. It means a brotherhood, a race determined by a common origin possessing a common blood. All Hindus claim to have in their veins the blood of the mighty race, incorporated with and descended from the Vedic fathers. This ancient Ganges of our blood, using a very religious reference to the river Ganges, has come down from the altitudes of the sublime Vedic heights to the plains of our modern history. So this feeling of common blood, Professor Chetan Bhatt says this mystical and spiritual folkish, the blood of the race and the passion of the race, is an extremely important trope in contemporary Hindu nationalist activism and its political languages. It embeds a sensuousness and pathos about belonging, which emphasizes its romanticism, and romanticism in the Germanic sense of 19th century German and French romanticism. Common blood could apply to Muslims too, because after all, most Muslims are converts who share this blood, supposedly. Most of them were not invaders and did not come from outside India originally. But motherland and fatherland also became holy land. And Muslims and Christians have their holy land in far-off Arabia or Palestine. So they cannot be incorporated into an Indian holy land unless they give out outside allegiances, converting to their essential nature. So in this development, Hindutva fulfilled the criteria of ethnic nationalism as it developed in Europe. Its motto, Hindu, Hindi, Hindustan, echoed many other European nationalisms based on religious identity, a common language, and even racial feeling. And even though many of these ideas about Aryans and the ancients of India and so on were prevalent among secular nationalist politicians as well, as I said, I mean, I grew up with some of the founding myths. They differed very starkly in not seeing India as a plural country, not seeing India with a single language, a single race, a single religion. In other words, Indian nationalism in its secular forms explicitly turned its face away from the ethnic blood and soil nationalisms of 19th century Europe. It was, and I think many European scholars have not understood it. So they see this as these forms of Hindu nationalism as more authentic, more real, more recognizable as European than what is actually developed in its, I mean, the Indian state doesn't live up to its ideals, but it founded a secular state, rejected the two-nation theory that founded Pakistan because it didn't believe that Muslims were a separate nation. And India is actually still one of the largest Muslim countries in the world, you know, pretty much the same number of Muslims in India as there are in Pakistan. So in the 19th century, when you know, these views first started being heard about invigoration and new forms of Hindu identity, Muslims didn't figure that largely in the first iterations of these. And the idea that they were responsible for the degradation of Hinduism and seeing a long line of what were seen as, look back on history, rewritten as Hindu wars against foreign invaders. So not only were Muslims and British invaders who were currently dominating, but there were earlier Muslim invaders to India. And this idea of Muslim invaders that helped to create the Hindu nation because Hindus fought against it is talked about by Savarkar in his book on Hindutva. And he really created a form of Hinduism which bears far more relationship to Judeo-Christian monotheistic religion than traditional Hinduism. And so just as the European version of the search for Aryan identity led to vicious anti-Semitism, it translated in Indian Aryan ideology into a hatred of religious minorities as inherently disloyal and external to the idea of a Hindu nation. So as the idea of an all-conquering Aryan race began to lose currency in scholarly writing, it took a firm hold on the imagination of Hindu right activists. So to sum up, by the late 20th century, the hypothesis of an Aryan invasion into India, with which I grew up, had been comprehensively rejected by scholars and by fundamentalists alike. But the rejection of these theories of the colonial era was on completely different grounds. Fundamentalists believe that Aryans did not invade because they were already there, and they came down divinely inspired. Modern scholarship rejects the invasion theory because linguistic and other evidence tends to support the idea that pastoralist groups came into the territory of modern South Asia over a long period of time, perhaps 1,000 years. They have not found evidence that there was a single dramatic invasion which destroyed a pre-existing civilization, as hypothesized by Mortimer Wheeler, the British archaeologist who in the early 20th century discovered the ruins of two cities. He suggested that the highly sophisticated urban civilization which he found in these cities, with a script that has even now not been deciphered, was destroyed by Aryans in invasions. But there's another divergence between the scholarly writing and the fundamentalist. While scholars tend to emphasize through their textual, linguistic, and archaeological analysis, the Arya that mentioned in the Rig Veda are a sign of status and were a linguistic category rather than race in the 19th century sense. For fundamentalists, Aryans are not only a race, but the original race, whose former glory must be restored. So the answers have no common ground on the problem of the identity of the Aryans, though both have antecedents in 19th century debates on Indo-Europeans. So this is important because both sides tend to trade insults based on the colonial origin of their ideas, so that what tends to be discussed is where the ideas came from, which is of some importance, but is not the determining factor in deciding whether they're sustained by any evidence. Now, everyone does accept the existence of a large urban civilization, which is known as the Indus Valley civilization, or by fundamentalists as the Saraswati civilization. And it wasn't just the two cities that were found in the early 20th century. There's some evidence that actually it was a huge civilization, which we still actually know very little about, and there are a lot of puzzles and a lot of work actually to be done to try and solve those. So linguistic theorists have dated the Rig Veda using comparative linguistics and comparing it with certain contemporary treaties in about 1500 BC, with that of the text of the Rig Veda, and looked at language and so on. And these methods have not yielded as early a date for the Rig Veda as the fundamentalists would like. So it's dated at about 1500 years BC and shown to post-date the Indus Valley civilization. While the decline of this civilization has not been explained and may have been due to environmental factors or other factors, the question of when the Aryans existed becomes of central importance. In a fundamentalist mindset, they could not have come later than a highly developed and extensive civilization. Because after all, everything was complete when they came. So how could something have been earlier that was not Aryan? So that civilization has to come after the Aryans, and it has to be absorbed somehow as a part of Aryan culture, even though scholarly consensus sees this as a non-Indo-European civilization, which did predate the Aryans or Indo-Europeans. So on the question of chronology or of the dating of when the Aryans were, there is no common ground either. And scholarship would suggest that the dating that I've suggested, that this mysterious Indus Valley civilization, I mean, a lot is known from archaeological evidence. It was very highly developed. It had, as Roman civilization, it had huge urban centers, probably traded. It had settled agriculture. It had wells, houses. The common people lived very well as there's a huge amount of physical evidence, which people didn't find physically, the evidence they kept looking for Indo-Aryans in quite the same way. But what I want to say is that these theories are being taught in classrooms and in textbooks wherever Hindutva ideologues have control, where they have political control, where they have ideological control. They're taught in their summer camps, they're taught in temples, they're shown in temples in England, for instance, in the Swaminarayan temple, which is a modern temple, which school children are taken to explain about Hinduism as sort of a multicultural exercise. These theories are present. And scholars who oppose them are attacked, their work is attacked, they're taken, there's an attempt, there's a fight back in India, which is, I think, a stronger fight back than there is abroad because people understand more about it. Now, in the end, what happens is that this isn't just an academic debate and it isn't just about attacking scholars. Because also there's the figure of Ram, who is a mythological figure, but a huge campaign, a mass campaign, which was a transnational campaign, and a pan-India campaign developed around demanding that a mosque supposedly built on the birthplace of Ram should be taken over and torn down and made into a temple. And that temple has never been built, but in 1992, Hindu right activists tore down that mosque. And in the course of their campaign, they traveled all over India, creating riots wherever they went and slaughtering people wherever they went. And that campaign was the indirect cause of the mass murder of Muslims in Gujarat, 2,000 Muslims murdered around and 100,000 displaced, and again similar numbers in Orissa of Christians in 2008. So in the UK and other places, secular politicians have embraced both Hindu and Muslim fundamentalists as allies, sometimes to promote the government's views in the war on terror and sometimes to oppose them. This remarkable outcome of sustained support for views which are fundamentally opposed to human rights has been driven by these cynical politicians. In both Britain and India, religious values have begun to drive social policy for entirely expedient reasons, putting at risk the spirit of inquiry and of skepticism. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions?
Some say that Hindu nationalism or Hindu fundamentalism is a reaction to Muslim fundamentalism. You don't agree with this?
No. I mean, you know, these theories, these movements, for instance, movements of social reform, some of which were very progressive movements or had progressive elements in them. Even the Arya Samaj had progressive elements, and even in its time and sometimes now. There were many movements of social reform to modernize religion. And they were not so much a reaction to each other, but a reaction to colonialism and the idea of the West and modernity and science and so on. There was a contemporary engagement. You know, people talk about this time lag. They try and sort of justify various kinds of fundamentalism as you know, there's just a time lag. You know, they'll go, you know, 400 years ago we weren't burnt witches, so it doesn't matter if a few women are stoned to death in Iran. I mean, that kind of argument. So. But in India, it wasn't a reaction to Muslim fundamentalism. It built on its own conduct with the British state. And yes, there was a back and forth between Hindu fundamentalists and Muslim fundamentalists, and a very murderous one. I mean, at partition in 47 and at various times later.
I was very interested at your mention at the end of your talk about how this is a real educational controversy in India, where people with these views are trying to get their views, are getting their views taught in certain areas. Is there an opposition to this? As in the United States, there's the National Center for Science Education. In Great Britain, there's the British Center for Science Education that is trying to keep, you know, good science in the schools. Is there something trying to keep good history in the schools?
Yeah, I mean, there's very good history in a lot of the schools because there is enormous opposition, and this is mostly in history and not in history and not in science directly. Although science teaching is affected because, as I said, there's all these. You know, there were when the Hindutva government was in power, they wanted to teach astrology as a science and things like that. So I mean, science is definitely affected as well. There is huge opposition. I think the opposition is greater in India than it is abroad, because abroad these might be accepted as people don't know the debates. Except, you know, some academics at universities know them, but a school teacher looking for materials to explain about Indian history in a class, you know, a multicultural class which has many Hindu students and so on, will quite often come across fundamentalist materials created and written by Hindutva people for use in schools and in religious education. We found this in Britain all the time, that a lot of the Christian religious stuff is appalling as well, but you know, the stuff that says what Islam is or what Hinduism is comes from fundamentalist sources and propagates these myths. So actually, I think it's harder to oppose it in the West. In India has a very strong secular academic culture which has stood up against it, which did rewrite you know, books and put them out, which, you know, will stand up against these things. But they often aren't backed by the politicians who are looking for votes and who, you know, basically comply with the bullying and religious demands of both the Hindu fundamentalists and the Muslim fundamentalists. And as we may find, because I understand this Indian skeptic was arrested, it depends whether the authorities decide to comply with the demands of the Catholics in this case. You know, because he opposed a so-called, he exposed a miracle. So, you know, there's a lot of playing politics with religion, but there's a huge opposition and an open debate and a lot of material created around that, yeah. Well, you see, that at the national level, where good scholars are in the boards that are working on things like history textbooks, the work will be based on scholarship. But there are masses of pamphlets, there are other people you know, producing materials, and the state governments have control. As you know, there are state governments that are Hindutva that decide that. I don't have, you know, I haven't done the kind of rigorous work that you've done on sort of actually mapping what happens where, but there's a huge circulation of popular educational materials, which, I mean, range over a lot of things, from Indians invented all of science 10,000 years ago, or whenever, millennia ago, whatever. Hitler was great. So a lot of Indian students who've grown up in contexts of Hindutva governments believe Hitler was a great man.
Is it the individual teacher who decides whether to teach Hitler was great or not, whether to teach astrology or not, or is that made by a state level?
There are boards. There are boards of education that have, but I mean, there's a lot of material other than the boards. And again, I think as Anila found, I mean, if a teacher has particular views and propagates them in class, and particularly if they have political backing behind them, because when I'm talking about these Hindu right organizations, they're not just political parties. They're political parties, but they're huge social organizations which train children from childhood. And they're in the professions, they're teaching the stuff. And so they can manage to work with the school curriculum and bring in other messages as well. So anti-Muslim messages, for instance, are absolutely common. They're not supposed to be there in any of the official government-produced national level material, but at the level of a state school, at a private school, even at a government school controlled in a particular area, this stuff will be absolutely common.
So teachers have a lot of autonomy, is what you're saying?
In effect, yes.
Thank you.
Can I ask, until a couple of years ago at least, there were departments of Vedic astronomy and Vedic maths in India at a couple of universities, and I wonder, are they still there, and what are their standing in the wider academic field? What do real mathematicians think about these things?
They probably laugh at them. I mean, I don't know. I'm not. As I said, I'm not a scientist.
Is this sort of the Billy Graham University of India, or are they sort of marginalized, highly
yeah, I mean, I don't think a mathematician would have much time for Vedic maths, or another scientist to have time for. I mean, there was a lot of opposition to the idea of teaching astrology as a science within a university. I mean, astrologers practice in India. Loads of people go to them. They treat them in all sorts of ways, as confessors, as analysts, as whatever. They want their future predicted, whatever. But most people. I mean, there are skeptics and rationalists and so on who expose whether they can actually predict the future or not and stuff like that. But mostly people who are skeptical of these things don't bother with them. But putting them in the university context, caused a huge storm of protest. But yeah, it happened in some places. I don't think it's treated that seriously, but it may in places where the Hindu right governments come into power, that they will promote this stuff.
Okay, sorry, but due to the time pressure, we have to go on. Thank you very much again.
The World Skeptics Congress, Paranormal, Supernatural, Fringe Science, Pseudoscience, and How It Really Is.
We're skeptically interrogating